Okay, so welcome to Eat, Move, Think, the show about optimal wellness brought to you by Medcan.
Wow. Do it again.
Oh, I was practicing.
Okay, ready?
Welcome
to
Eat, Move, Think,
The show about
Optimal
wellness.
brought to you by
Medcan.
Yeah, this is extremely good. Thank you.
Okay, so Chris, we know that exercise is good for us,
Yes.
and we know that being outside is good for us.
Yeah, being outside, fresh air, birdsong.
So do you think exercising outside in nature is doubly beneficial?
I mean, I would think so. The question you're asking is cycling in some remote ravine better than being on your exercise bike in your condo?
Yeah, and if it is, then how is it better for you?
Yeah, that's interesting.
So there isn't actually a lot of research out there currently about the combined effects of exercising outside in nature. And there are two researchers from the University of Victoria. They set out to test that hypothesis about whether exercising outside in nature, in the greenery, is actually healthier for you in some way than exercising inside.
So what did they discover?
Well, that's what this episode is all about. We're going to be interviewing them and hearing about their findings. I'm Jasmine Ratch.
I'm Chris Shulgin. We're the producers of Eat, Move, Think.
And in this episode, we have Medcan CEO and Chair Shaun Francis talking to Dr. Olav Krigolson. He's the head of the University of Victoria's Theoretical and Applied Neuroscience Lab.
He's interviewed alongside PhD student Katherine Boere, neuroscience doctoral candidate at the University of Victoria. She's also an alpine runner and climber.
Shaun Francis is sitting down with Dr. Olav Krigolson and Katherine Boere to talk about the cognitive benefits that you can gain from working out outside in nature.
They talk about why you might want to rethink bringing along your connected device when you're exercising on a nature trail or on a rural road.
And they actually break down the science of whether it's better to be working out in a forest versus in a city, in a downtown core.
Dr. Olav Krigolson is a great guest. Perhaps because he has a podcast himself. It's called That Neuroscience Guy. And he really is able to break down complex scientific concepts in ways that are easy for lay people to understand. It's an interesting episode.
And you can tell he loves what he does.
So if you find yourself defaulting to just exercising in a gym and not really going outside, this episode may cause you to rethink some of that behavior, because it really is all about getting outside and the extra benefits that provides your wellness.
So we'll let them get into it. Here's Dr. Olav Krigolson and Katherine Boere in conversation with Medcan CEO Shaun Francis.
Here's Shaun.
Hi, it's Shaun Francis, host of the Eat, Move, Think podcast, and I'm really excited today to be welcoming Dr. Olav Krigolson and Katherine Boere to our show to talk about a really interesting study this year in the scientific reports about activity in outdoors, something that I'm extremely passionate about. But first, perhaps I can ask you both to introduce yourselves and just tell our audience a little bit about, what you do and how you arrived here with this work.
Yeah, thanks, Shaun. My name's Olav Krigolson, and I'm a neuroscientist at the University of Victoria. There, I run the Theoretical and Applied Neuroscience Laboratory. Our research program is about 50% basic science, and we study how people learn and how they make decisions. And 50% of our research is applied, which is trying to take neuroscience out of the lab and into the real world, which is where this project fits in.
That's terrific. Thank you, Olav. And Katherine?
Yeah, thanks, Shaun. So my name's Katherine. I'm a PhD student at the University of Victoria. Olav is my supervisor. I study human decision-making and learning, and with a strong focus on reward processing. My background is in biomedical engineering and math, and I have a very long history of being really active and outdoors, and very much has motivated my interest in this subject.
Victoria must be a great place to develop that interest.
Yeah, when I recruit graduate students, one of the extreme diversions is you snowboard in the morning and go surfing in the afternoon, which is possible.
Can you tell me what's the inspiration behind this study? Where did the idea come from? Do you both spend a lot of time outside?
Yeah, I grew up as a runner outside, and kind of that grew to trail running and hiking, and then a lot of climbing and alpine climbing. In my early 20s, I started doing longer distance trail running, so ultra running. And that's kind of weaved throughout my 20s to be a combination of climbing and alpine running. And yeah, really, it's just been fueled by passion and love for the outdoors and feeling amazing when I'm finished these events.
Much like you, Shaun and Catherine, I'm an outdoors kind of guy. I mountain bike, I snowboard. Any excuse to get outside, I do. But in case of this study, I was actually sitting in my office, stared out the window, trying to think of new cool ideas and just life, and probably upset with undergraduate students in general or something. But I saw the running trail. We have this beautiful running trail around the University of Victoria, and no one's on it. They're all inside the gym on Stairmasters and things like this. And I thought, we have a city where we don't get a lot of snow. Why don't people exercise out more? And there's a body of literature that shows that exercise is good for the brain. And there's a body of literature that shows that being outside is good for the brain. So I was just sort of inspired by the lack of people using our running trail. I just started thinking we should test this. And that was really where it came from, was just this idea that we all feel better when we're outside and we all feel better when we're exercising outside. But let's try to get some hard data and show that that's true.
And you mentioned, Olav, that there is a lot of work done in this area, but how definitive is it and what's additive about your study?
Well, we didn't really find a lot that did both. Like, there is this body of literature that shows that exercise is good for the brain. One of my favorite studies, dates back to the 60s, when they basically showed that kids that wrote math tests after physical education did better than kids that wrote math tests after, say, social studies. And there's been a ton of research since then. In terms of the being outdoors, there's a lot of research that shows that being outdoors is good for you, right? If you spend time in a park versus spend the time inside a building, people perform better and feel better. So the idea was just to glue the two things together and look at it. What's kind of neat about what we did is we work a lot with mobile technology, and we were able to capture the brain waves in a couple of minutes, as opposed to a very artificial lab-based study. We did this in the real world effectively. And that definitely makes us unique.
I also think it's unique the time frame that we were looking at. A lot of the previous literature on exercise and its kind of implications on the brain and cognitive function are looking at longer time periods. So we were kind of particularly interested in this brief period. Can you just go for a 10 to 15 minute walk and get some benefits?
And how do you design the study to investigate this combined effect?
So what we had participants do in the study was they came back on separate occasions. So the first time they came, they would either walk inside or outside. And then the next time they came back, they would do the opposite. And with that, we were able to compare what we found between the two different conditions and see, was there the same impact from just walking in general, or did that outside influence actually increase the cognitive function that we measured?
So how are you measuring it? Can you describe that?
Absolutely. So as Olav said, we use mobile imaging for this study. And what we were looking at, they're called event-related potentials, and it's the electrical activity that we're measuring in your brain in response to a certain stimulus or something in front of you. In particular, we used a really well-known cognitive task called the oddball task. And in this task, so you have flashing dots in this task. So one of them is going to be blue, one of them is going to be green. It's very simple. They're just flashing in front of you. Kind of the key thing here is that one of them is going to be frequent and one is going to be infrequent. So one of them is going to happen 75% of the time and the other is going to happen 25% of the time. And so what we were actually measuring is your brain's response to this novel stimulus, or this one that's flashing 25% of the time, and how much attention you were putting into looking or capturing this new information in your environment. So that's how we look at that in a very controlled way, but you could relate it to kind of like looking at a new environment in your room. And this response that we measured is looking at, okay, so what is new information to me and what's important to me?
I think the key piece to this too is the emphasis on mobile, because people I don't think truly grasp how mobile we are. So if I said I was going to measure your brainwaves, Shaun, you might have heard of EEG and you might think about a whole bunch of electrodes. And if we did this in the lab or in a hospital, it's going to take 45 minutes to put all these electrodes on your head, and you're tethered, right? You're tied to a computer. The headband we use for this study is the Muse headband. It's made by a company in Toronto there, Interaxon. It's sold as a meditation assistant, and now also helps with sleep. Well, we use it to measure those event responses that Katherine mentioned. And to make it truly mobile, we developed an app called Peer. And with Peer, we can measure your brainwaves from an iPhone. So our setup time goes from 45 minutes to about 1 minute. All right. You put on the headband, open up the app, and away you go. And that way, when Katherine said we were able to measure these brain responses, we were doing it literally within minutes before they started to walk and minutes after. So we were truly capturing what was happening, due to the walk itself.
And who participated in this study?
Undergraduate students at the University of Victoria. Most cognitive neuroscience research like this is done on undergraduate populations. One of the future directions would definitely be to expand this out to other demographics. We do work with people that are older all the time. That's just in this study, we grabbed some undergraduates and they were our demographics. So what you'd expect, your classic slice of the Canadian university scene.
And how was it constructed? Was there a control group?
Everyone in the study did both the walks. So
Okay.
basically, as Katherine said, if you were in the study, Shaun would bring you in and randomly decide whether you're walking inside or outside. We'd measure your brain waves and off you'd go for your walk. And then we'd measure them again at the end. And then the next day when we brought you back, you would do the opposite. So if you walked indoors the first day, you'd walk outside. And being good scientists, Katherine and I made sure that people were not listening to outside sounds, that their heart rate was approximately the same, their walking speed was approximately the same. So we controlled for all that. So we were really trying to just get at the effect of exercise, because both times you are walking 15 minutes and we've got this pre-measurement and post-measurement, but also the inside versus outside comparison, which is the key finding.
And can you describe what the findings were for our listeners?
Yeah, Katherine, it's your study. Take it away.
Sure, yeah. So as I was talking about that event-related potential or that neural response that we were recording, what we found is that there was a larger component that we were measuring after the outdoor walk versus the indoor walk. And what that really tells us is that after the outdoor walk, participants were able to pay more attention or focus more on the task at hand. And so what that really tells us, or ideas of what could actually be going on there, there's a few theories behind it, particularly around the outdoor piece. There's a few known theories. One is the attentional restoration theory. And the idea behind that is, it begins with how we kind of live our lives, our modern day society, as in we're constantly kind of bombarded with our phone and stimulus, and things are kind of constantly vying for our attention, right? I'm sure everyone can relate to that, various notifications. And so what we kind of think happened is when you go outside for this walk versus inside, you're able to give your brain a little more of a break from all that stimulus, versus indoors, there's still quite a bit of stimulus. And so when you go out and you take this break, it allows your cognitive resources to actually restore, kind of in the same way that if you were doing interval training, you would need to rest to be able to get to the same activity after. The same thing is going on in your brain. You need that rest in order to have a better performance next. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So you're saying that outdoors, there's less potential stimuli. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, yes.
In our case, they were walking on the running trail around the university, so they weren't able to see like cars moving by and stuff like that. So when you think of outdoors, this is our equivalent to being on a trail in the woods, right? Being on campus at the University of Victoria, there wasn't a lot of wildlife. And as I mentioned earlier, not as many people as I'd like use those running trails. So you could imagine outdoor environments where there is a lot of stimuli. It's just this one, there wasn't.
So that's interesting. So for example, if you did your outdoor walk in an urban center, would that be no different than an indoor physical activity?
One of the most challenging things that Katherine had to deal with, and I'll let her comment on this, is that there's a lot of possible explanations for what we found. So that sets the stage for a lot of follow-up studies. I suspect, based on the attention theory, that if you were walking in a busy urban environment, I just spent the afternoon walking through downtown Glasgow, and I can tell you my attention was being captured by anything and everything. So I think you would probably get more benefits with the attentional idea if you were somewhere a bit more isolated, so on a mountain trail or something like this. That's at least one hypothesis. But Another possible explanation is as if something about being outside is better for you. We didn't measure oxygen flow, for instance. There's the effect of natural sunlight. There's so many possible variables that we could be busy pulling this apart for a couple of years if we really wanted to.
Yeah. So if I were to recap, it's possible that in an urban environment with tons of stimuli, it may be no different than working out inside.
That is a testable hypothesis. Katherine, what do you think? What's your hunch?
Intuitively, yes.
That's assuming the attention hypothesis is the explanation. If it's the sunlight hypothesis, then walking around in the city, although admittedly today in Glasgow, there wasn't exactly a lot of sun, but you get the idea, right? There's something about being outside.
I also think it's never going to be one of these things, right? They're going to come together to facilitate like the optimal restoration or whatever theory we think is going on behind it. So I feel like it would probably be in varying degrees.
We started off the discussion around how there's two different bodies of work, but to date, it hasn't been done in tandem. What's the theory around how being outside helps your brain, just from that perspective?
I'd say there's a lot of competing theories. As most people are aware, and I'm assuming your listeners are aware, a lot of people talk about the benefits of natural sunlight. And there is research that shows, despite our best efforts to create lighting environments that are supposed to parallel that, nothing's as good as being outside under the sun. It could be oxygen. There are studies that look at airflow differences between when you're outside versus inside. Of course, that would depend on the ventilation of the inside environment. Some studies are even simpler, which is they talk about the calming effects of nature, right? Just the fact that we have this natural inbred response that if we see trees and we see, water and things like that, that causes our brains to relax and unwind a bit. It's just a natural response that we have. So as Katherine pointed out very accurately, there's a lot of ideas on this one, and I don't think there's a definitive answer. The only thing that the different research groups can agree on is that being outside is good for you. Because I have a hypothesis too. I try to walk every morning, and I can tell you in Victoria in February at 6:30 in the morning, it's not a pleasant experience being outdoors. It's typically raining and cold and the rest of it. So there's factors like even something as simple as the weather.
Right, which may or may not be additive.
Yeah, exactly. It's the kind of science that I like because it just leads to lots of studies. We've got a lot of undergraduates that work with us, and we can probably get them going on a lot of different combinations of this in the future.
Was there anything surprising?
Yeah, Kat, you had some thoughts about the exercise duration and the benefits, right?
Yeah, I think what was particularly surprising to me, although also a bit intuitive, was how brief an amount of time you could just go for a 10 to 15 minute walk and get this cognitive benefit. I think it's pretty powerful and amazing. And I have some more ideas, I think, on follow-up studies on more looking into that duration and how long is optimal. And as with everything, I think there are points when too much is not great for you, right? So everything in moderation, but I'm more interested in what specific duration would be optimal because nothing has really looked quite at that yet.
I have to agree with it because, I'm Shaun, you're busy like everybody else is, like myself. And, there's times where I don't go to the gym because I think, well, I don't have an hour. I've only got 30 minutes. And so to know that all I need is 15 minutes to get some kind of brain benefit, I'm not saying I'd reduce all my workouts to 15 minutes, but on those days when that's all I have, that's kind of cool to see that.
For sure. And we don't know, like you said, Katherine, we're not sure what length of walk, for example, would be beneficial.
Yeah, and there's a trade-off here too, which is this is a brain result, which is sort of independent of the physiological result, right? Which is we know if you want to burn calories, 15 minutes isn't going to get you very far. You need to be going longer than that. But, it depends what your goal of exercise is. You burn some calories with 15 minutes. It's just not the ideal length. But these brain benefits, I think a lot of it in terms of we've just we're coming out of the COVID pandemic, depending on who you listen to. But this idea that everyone was stressed and depressed and hit by that. And the fact that we know that exercise is good for you, well, get outside, go for a walk, and it might be the mental pickup you need.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you guys are lucky, I think, to be in Victoria, where I'm sure it's very green, but for many urban dwellers, it's hard to access that benefit easily.
We definitely have an advantage in the sense that we have a lot of parks in and around town, and you don't have to drive very far to. People are always amazed when they come visit to find out that you can drive less than an hour and not have cell phone reception.
There's a couple really interesting studies that are more just looking at the nature aspect. And they found that even just looking at pictures of nature can boost your cognitive function a little bit. So even just considering that.
I was going to say I could follow up with that because most people haven't heard of this. We've done a bit of work with NASA in the past, but they're spending a lot of effort on putting virtual reality on the International Space Station. Mm-hmm. And the reason for it is to put people in a green space. The one thing the astronauts tend to report back is that they really miss being outside. So some of the best VR systems in the world are being flown to space to literally put astronauts outside. Now, it won't be the same as being outside, but as Katherine said, if a picture gets you some benefit, then a good VR experience should do the same as well.
Well, for Katherine, is there any research, and did you touch on it in your study about the effect of all the wearable technology? So, for example, if I'm out, be it cycling or walking in your example, but I've got my iPhone, with me, an indoor watch with all sorts of potential stimuli, could that negate some of the effects of being outside?
Yes, it could. There is a lot of actual literature that's looked at this, where this idea of being disengaged from the world and the benefits in terms of wellness. So not just exercise, but wellness overall. So the Microsoft research team during COVID did a lot of work looking at this very issue. And if your phone's pinging you every minute with a text message or an email and you're reading them, that sort of wellness benefit you get from exercise is partially negated. So this idea that if you can, put yourself into airplane mode or something so you can, listen to music's fine, podcasts, audiobooks, even having a conversation with a friend if it's relaxing. But if it's stuff that's going to increase your stress levels, then the anti-stress benefit of exercise isn't going to be the same. So wearable technology, good, lots of reasons to do so, but possibly things that are part of wearables, like the things that might increase your anxiety, like texts or emails or social media, maybe give those a miss for your duration of your exercise.
I also think that brings us back to the attentional theory that we were discussing that might be behind some of these benefits. Like if the time outside and the exercise outside is giving you this kind of brain break in a sense, if you continue with that stimulus, you're not really going to get that same recharge in your cognitive system, and therefore you probably won't have the same benefits coming out of it. From our research and looking at other literature, what I would recommend is trying to take a full break when you're out there. I know that there's safety reasons to have your phone and things on you, and I do the same, but I think if you're able to give yourself that full brain break, it's going to have the most benefits for you.
That's very interesting. I mean, because we talk about green space, does it need to be green? So for example, if you're in the mountains or a desert, is there any work done on that? Like, does it matter what kind of outdoors it is?
That's a really good question. I would imagine that as long as it's a positive experience. Last time I went hiking in the desert, it wasn't the most pleasant thing I've ever done. So that might be a negative impact, but I look for any excuse possible to get on the side of a mountain. So to me, that would be a beneficial thing.
I think part of what's going to be variable there is like air temperature. And if your body gets too hot, then it's not like you're going to get dehydrated. And these various other factors start to play in that necessarily aren't that great for cognitive function or your health. So I think with the different kind of environments that you could encounter outside, that is something to consider. I do know there has been quite a bit of literature just on forest spaces. That seems to be where most of the literature is coming out of rather than deserts. But again, more areas that we need some more research in.
And are you guys planning more research? Do you have any other studies in the works?
Definitely. This study alone has lent itself to 4 or 5 follow-up ideas. Probably the biggest problem we have is there's only so many hours in the day, if you will. But definitely, it's an area of interest. We've done stuff in the past with baseball where we're looking at, brain performance and actually batting percentages. So can you predict how someone's going to do hitting a baseball if you measure their brain activity prior to them hitting a baseball? Katherine's got some cool ideas on athlete burnout for endurance athletes. So we're in the space in the ballpark. So we'll probably keep playing.
From our listener perspective, what are the actionable insights that they should take away from this?
If I was going to give you two or three, I would say, well, one, get outside. There's evidence now that getting outside matters. So if you're just going to do a quick burst of activity, why not do it outside, right? That's probably the biggest one, is just that knowledge there. Like I said, I use the gym and stuff, and I'd be lying if I said every walk I do is outside. But the fact that it's important to do that, because I definitely have friends that all of their exercise occurs indoors. So I would say just that push for outside. How about you, Katherine?
I think one thing that really helps is choosing activities that you actually enjoy. Maybe you don't like walking and you do like biking. If that's going to get you outside, I think that's fantastic. We only looked at walking in this study, but I think exercise outdoor is obviously going to have a positive impact. So whatever way you do that, I think it's great. I think starting small is, like, particularly if you're not used to exercising regularly outside or regularly, it's like, make small goals. It doesn't need to be a massive amount of time, right? Like 10 to 15 minutes is all we're saying here. It doesn't need to be hours. So make it really, I think, sustainable and accessible for yourself.
And I'd have to say this coming from the West Coast, which is, if you are going to exercise outside, like Katherine said, especially if you're going to try going on trails and things, make sure you're prepared. One of the horrors of hiking on Vancouver Island is when you see someone going up on a mountain trail in a pair of flip-flops, and you're kind of going, okay, there go your ankles. So know what you're getting yourself into.
Absolutely. That's super interesting. And, we have done a lot of work on our podcast on the benefits of exercise and being outside, but it's super interesting to see the results of something where you're looking at both. And I would encourage our listeners absolutely to get their exercise in, but also to take advantage of all the green spaces that they can.
Well, thank you so much for having us, Shaun. It's been a pleasure to be on.
Thank you so much, Shaun.
Yeah, thank you, Katherine, and thank you, Olav.
That was Medcan CEO Shaun Francis in conversation with Dr. Olav Krigolson, the head of University of Victoria's Theoretical and Applied Neuroscience Laboratory, and his PhD student Katherine Boere, who is a neuroscience doctoral candidate at the University of Victoria.
Follow Medcan on Twitter and Instagram at MedcanLiveWell.
You can follow Dr. Krigolson on Twitter at That Neurosci Guy.
That Neurosci Guy. That's ThatNeurosciGuy. That Neurosci Guy.
And you can follow Katherine Boere on Twitter as well at Katherine_Boere. That's KATHERINE_BOERE. We'll post Dr. Krigolson and Katherine Boer's study, as well as other cool studies about the benefits of nature and outdoor movement, on our website, eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Say hello and send us a tip or a suggestion by emailing us at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com. Eat Move Think is produced by Ghost Bureau. Jasmine Ratch is managing producer.
Social media and strategy support is from Chantel Gurtin, Andrew Imix, and Emily Bozick.
I'm executive producer Christopher Shulgin. We'll be back soon with another episode examining the latest in health and wellness.
This podcast episode is intended to provide general information about health and wellness only, and is not designed or intended to constitute or be used as a substitute for medical advice, treatment, or diagnosis. You should always talk to your Medcan healthcare provider for individual medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment, including your specific health and wellness needs. This podcast is based on the information available at the time of preparation and is only accurate and current as of that date. Source information and recommendations are subject to change based on scientific evidence as it evolves over time. Medcan is not responsible for future changes or updates to the information and recommendations, and assumes no obligation to update based on future developments. Reference to or mention of specific treatments or therapies does not constitute or imply a recommendation or endorsement. The links provided within the associated document are to assist the reader with any specific information highlighted. Any third-party links are not endorsed by Medcan. Links are not endorsed